Welcome to the Be What You Want podcast. My name's Chris Hall, and today we're interviewing one of the pioneers of the snowboarding sport. It's Mr. Paul Graves, and just to give you an idea of who this man is, he was the 1979 Freestyle Snurfing Champion. And for those that don't know, snurfing was this wonderful device that was the predecessor to snowboarding. It was something that you stood on without bindings and had a rope in the middle, and it was intended originally to be almost a backyard toy, and we're going to talk about that. Now, Paul was also one of the first sponsored riders. He was the founder of the 1982 National Snow Surfing Championship, which has become the US Open that still operates today. He was a coach to many riders that have made it to the Olympics, and indeed he's consulted to the X Games. So, Paul, welcome to the podcast. It really is a pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I'm looking forward to putting some history out there.
That's it. So, Paul, let's talk about snurfing. What did it feel like the first time you got on a snurfer, and how old were you?
I was 10 years old. It was 1964 when I first began putting 2 feet on a single device and sliding down the hill. And in 1966, a company called the Brunswick Corporation actually introduced the first product called the Snurfer. And I was one of the first ones to get one of these products and take it to the hill. And to answer your question, it was kind of wild and reckless. It was uncharted territory. You're right, there was no bindings. There was nothing to keep you on a snurfer except your body weight. So you could have some wild rides.
Now, how were you spotted to become the first sponsored rider, and was that with Brunswick?
It was with Brunswick. I had a friend whose father actually worked for the company, and it was through that contact to where the Brunswick Corporation found out that there was this crazy kid who could do some interesting things on their product. So that was a relationship that blossomed and developed. I rode for the Snurfer company all the way up until its ending, which was 1979.
So I understand, here's a little fun fact for people, that the Brunswick Corporation had nothing to do with winter sports. They were involved in making pool tables and other bowling alley components. Am I right on that?
You are correct. And the Snurfer came from a leftover piece of a pool table, a steamed corner, which is, the Snurfer has an upturned nose on the front, which is the steamed corner of the pool table. So yeah, they pretty much took a piece of scrap and turned it into the Snurfer.
Wow. Now, talk about, being resourceful and applying it to something that hasn't been done yet. That's an incredible story. So tell me again, like when you got on a snurfer for the first time, what did it actually feel like? It must have been quite a thrill.
Anybody that was around in the early 60s, you were exposed to 2 things that were similar. One was surfing in the ocean, and the other was another sport that was very new to the scene called skateboarding. Now, I had been skateboarding at this same time when I was 10, 11, and 12 years old. So to go from early skateboarding to early snowboarding, it was just a natural progression. One was on the pavement, one was on the snow.
That's it. So it must have felt incredible. Now, snurfing indeed was the natural evolution from both surfing and skateboarding as 2 emerging sports. Now, in terms of how snurfing specifically began the journey that became snowboarding, I understand that a snurfing national championship emerged, and indeed it was the 1979 one where you won the Freestyle Champion. Can you tell us a little bit about the trick that you did at the end and how you even created the category that was new at the time called freestyling?
Right. Well, in 1979, the existing Snurfer competition, which was a very local almost a community event run through the Muskegon Community College. So it wasn't pulling from a national audience. It was pretty much a local community college winter festival. I was sponsored by the company at that time, and there was only a downhill event, and it was a timed speed event. And that was something that I had just personally gotten bored with. So I started experimenting with other moves that I was seeing both in ocean surfing and skateboarding. So I introduced surface 360s while spinning downhill. I threw some of those in, and kind of I had a signature ending to my run, which was I would slam to a stop and do a front flip dismount. And at the time, there weren't, I didn't know any, but I don't think there were many people who were starting to experiment with freestyle moves. So two things happened in 1979, Chris. One was my involvement, and the other was the introduction of someone named Jake Burton, who came to the competition. So introducing freestyle and introducing competition among manufacturers was something that was starting to blossom in the late 70s.
Well, this is the thing, right? So you did this killer move, everyone was blown away, and all of a sudden they realized they had to create a category on the spot, and you won it because I believe that you were the only person that had the guts to do that move, and you nailed it, and there you go. You were the winner because you just did something that hadn't been done before, to give you credit for that.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much how it happened. I mean, it was not something that was well thought out or planned. It just was evolution doing its thing.
And this is the thing I want to talk about through this podcast. You know, when you're trying to do something new, that whole thing about doing it one step at a time, it evolves. People come along. You know, it's not just about what you're doing. It's about what's happening amongst the community. And, you know, let's then focus on Jake, because you had the downhill speed competition. All of a sudden you introduce a new category called, the freestyle snurfing, and you win that. And then Jake Burton comes along with something else that is starting to look like something that's not a snurfer, and perhaps this thing that became a snowboard. So what happened there? What was your involvement, and how did history change in 1979?
Well, it changed in a couple of ways. One was the groundswell was starting to happen. There were enough numbers of participants taking place that I could recognize that there was something bigger happening here. We were going from the backyards to the back hills to the mountains. Jake showing up, showing that there was another way to build a snowboard or a snow surfer. And another big thing that happened from that event was, with my title, I was approached by a major beer manufacturer from Canada to perform in a ad campaign, and it culminated in a 2-week film shoot, putting together a 30-second commercial that would run across the US and Canada. So it was a matter of gaining exposure, showing other young people at the time that here was something new. It was different from skiing, different from tobogganing or other snow sports. So it was really the birth of snowboarding that came out of the 1979 event.
Right, that's brilliant. And that commercial was indeed with Labatt's beer, and that really, talk about like a brand positively associating with something that's emerging. It really helps launch it. So that's fascinating. And for those that don't know, I understand that Jake turned up with this thing that wasn't a snurfer, and you actually were involved in defending Jake's right to race that day and be entered into the competition. Is that right?
Yeah, you're right, Chris. I mean, at that point, I had invested 15 years into something that I believed could grow into something bigger, but there were obstacles every step of the way. Now, I was at the event as a paid sponsored rider for the Snurfer company, but it bothered me that they were taking an attitude that someone with a different product would not be allowed to compete. That bothered me a great deal. So I went against my boss that day and fought for the right for Jake to enter the competition to see how he would match up against other competitors. So, like they created a freestyle event for me, we created an open division for Jake to compete in. And it's interesting, he was the only one to compete in his division. So he won that title. But we left that 1979 event. I had a new friend, a guy named Jake, and somebody who had the same strong drive to, in his case, he wanted to make a Burton snowboard. In my case, I came out of 1979 recognizing that there was a sport that was being born, but that created its own set of issues. So at that moment, I decided to promote the sport, whereas Jake decided to promote Burton boards, and other people who were surfacing were promoting different products.
Right, and that's a fascinating distinction, and that's very strategic and insightful to make that distinction at that early part of the game. Now, in terms of your involvement with, let's just call it snowboarding to broaden the terms, with your involvement from 1979 onwards, even before or after 82, what was your biggest disappointment and how did you recover from that?
Well, it wasn't just one disappointment. There was roadblock after roadblock. At first, I was told, this is silly. Go home. You know, it's nothing will ever come of this. Well, it was fun to me. I stuck with it. I got better at it. I started going to ski mountains who had never been approached before. They were for skiers and skiers only. So as I worked with the Snurfer company and started touring around ski areas, I would give demos at mountains, meet with the mountain managers, and I recognized that the one thing that was going to motivate them to do this was money, numbers. It was going to take people knocking on those ski area doors, holding a snowboard in their hand, letting the industry know, my money's green too. All I need is a ski lift to get up the mountain, just like your skiers. And I want to snowboard down the hill rather than ski down the hill. It was, to me, it was a no-brainer.
Right. So I'm hearing a distinction. Sorry to interrupt. I'm hearing a distinction of sport versus manufacturing for you at that point, and also that inspiration of we need to show them the money.
Yeah. I mean, at that point in time, you could buy a snowboard, but you didn't have any place to go use it unless you were willing to hike up what you were then going to ride down. And back in those days, I hiked up a lot of mountains because there was no other way to get up to the top.
Wow. Now, at the 1982 inaugural national event of snow surfing, right? I understand there's a cool story around the start gate. Could you tell us about the start gate? Because this was in Woodstock, if I got my history right, and you're on the mountain at Suicide 6, and you're about to, set up for the day and have the competition. Now, the mountain was meant to have provided the start gate, but something didn't work out on the day. What happened?
Right. I got there very, very early, about 6 in the morning, and was looking over the course. They had groomed the course, and we had a finish line, and we were on the toughest, steepest slope that this mountain, which was called Suicide 6, had, called the face. What they didn't properly prepare was the starting area. So I was at a loss. I wasn't quite sure what to do, but we had a national championship to put on. So at spur of the moment, I decided, I ran home. I only lived about 10 minutes away, and told my wife, who was sitting at the kitchen table having a cup of coffee, that I needed to borrow the kitchen table, which was a big old 1950s metal Formica monster. Threw it in my pickup truck, drove back to the mountain. We dragged it up the hill, dug a hole up at the top, put my kitchen table upside down, filled it with snow, and used the two big metal dining leg table legs as our starting gate. So I have some really good footage of all of our early snowboarders tearing out of the starting gate of my kitchen table.
And here's the thing, like we could look at that footage and we could just talk about every single rider, who they were at the time and the impact that they went to have on the world, you know, but that would, like, there's just so much jam packed into that event. Now that really put things on the map. Indeed, that started to create a truly national event that, you know, went beyond snurfing. And I think that was the vision that you put into action. After the success of 1982, inevitably it would start coming into a phase of, right, well, what's next? So I understand you started having conversations with other mountains, including Stowe in Vermont, which is a famous range. I understand you've got an interesting letter in response to your application to run the event at Stowe. Can you read that out for us? Because this one tickles me.
I do, and you're right, Chris. The 82 event. Two things happened. One, we did have a great deal of success. We showed that we could take on a tough course, a tough mountain, and get through it. But the other thing was we wanted to go bigger. And so I did send out letters to other mountains thinking that they would be lining up to host us in 1983. So I went up and gave what I thought was an amazing presentation to the management at Stowe, and left feeling pretty good. Well, they wrote me back on October 7th, 1982. Here's what the letter says. Dear Paul, first of all, I want to thank you for the presentation you gave us about snowboarding. It certainly looks like everyone is having a good time. After discussion with the other parties involved, we have decided that we are not interested in holding the 1983 National Championships in Stowe. There are two reasons for our decision, and I feel you are entitled to know what they are. First of all, in fairness to you and the other people who would be taking part, we feel it would be misleading to hold the event in Stowe. We will not at this time or probably ever allow snowboarding on our slopes and trails, and it seems unfair to show an interest by holding a race merely for the publicity value to us. Secondly, we felt a certain amount of negativism toward skiing by those interested in snowboarding. Rather than being a sport that coexists with skiing, it seems to be more of a sport to replace skiing. I do thank you for your time and wish you the best in finding a suitable site for your event. Sincerely, Stowe Mountain. Now, what's interesting here, we flash forward to 2018, and snowboarding is a major part of Stowe Mountain's success, participant numbers, and cash flow. And that's true at mountains around the world. Back in 1982, there was virtually no mountain anywhere that would allow you to go snowboarding.
Gotta tell you what, when you're trying to do something new, that just resounds with that wisdom of people won't understand, they'll feel threatened, they'll say no to you, and they won't be open to any form of reasonable argument or openness, and they're just going to say no. But it's only up to us ever to persevere amongst that, isn't it? So that's just brilliant. Knowing where snowboarding came from and is now, knowing that those mountains said no, that to me just fills me with determination in anything that one wants to do as a new venture. So I love that. I love that. I almost get a kick out of the rejection. It's like, it's incredible, but that must have been very challenging at the time as well.
You know, Chris, it crosses all lines. We're sitting here talking about snowboarding, but you could insert almost any new product across the spectrum. The easiest thing in the world for anybody to do or say is no. And so many people either don't believe strongly enough in what they're doing. There's a host of reasons why people walk away from something that they really want to try and do. I just stuck with it. I had a supportive wife. My family supported me. We had a lot of lean years back in the 70s and 80s, but just loving it the way I did, not willing to take no for an answer. I think somebody said to me appropriately, when you're dealing with mountains, when you have a big rock in front of you, you can go up and over it, or sometimes you have to go around it, but you can't go through it. So for me, it was perseverance, believing, and just kept knocking on the doors.
Wow. Love, perseverance, and adaptability. Go around the rock, right? Keep going. What a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful story. Okay. So after 82, this then became an annual competition. We're already, one way or another, it continued, right? The seed had been planted that has grown into a wonderfully strong event. Now, your career then carried on evolving. I understand that in the mid-80s, you were involved in something called the Swingbo. Now, the Swingbo, for those that don't know, was a hybrid between a snowboard and two pairs of skis, and they actually got put together with a raised platform with some springs, and you leant on it, and it was raised off the ground. Now, you were involved in the design of that. How did you come up with a design like the Swingbo?
The Swingbo's history started in the very early 80s, and they're out of Germany. So there was an original prototype that looked like a skateboard on skis. That really is the best way to explain what a Swingbo was. At the time, the industry, as I've said, was fighting any progress for snowboarding. They wanted things that skis had. They wanted retention devices. They wanted runaway ski brakes to stop skis from sliding down the hill. They were asking for reasonable safety concerns. Now, the Swingbo was a hybrid between snowboarding, skateboarding, and skiing, and it was an attempt to answer those safety concerns. So we took that original prototype, which did not work very well, and it got tweaked and reworked and redesigned. And we came up with parabolic skis long before the ski industry were using parabolic skis. It had a ski brake, it had retention devices, but it wasn't simple like snowboarding. The Swingbo had a great run in Europe, but it just didn't catch on as big as it might have had the ski industry had a different outlook on snowboarding. And they really just didn't want anything that was associated with a snowboard on the mountains.
That is exactly it, isn't it? Talk about something, that's a great example of probably something being 5-10 years ahead of its time. Awesome product, so fun. Had snowboarding already been fully accepted on the mountains, then perhaps the Swingbo might have had a different journey. Yeah, it's interesting.
And another hurdle on this same product was it even threatened snowboarding. There were certain manufacturers, Burton being the biggest at the time, they were petrified of the Swingbo because it offered safety items that were not available on the snowboards at the time. So it was a split in the industry for about 5 years, and then the Swingbo just fizzled out.
And that, again, talk about pioneering days and decades of a whole sport. There's two paradoxical forces going on. You've got the unification effort of things like the 1982 championship and what that became as an annual event. So it's unifying people together as a sport. And then in parallel, you've got competition and the threat from one another, the challenges of the mountain. And really what I'm hearing from yourself, and I'm sure everyone that was involved in that, is that the things that get you through are the love. It's the love combined with a lot of determination and adaptability. Is that a fair assessment of what it was like in?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And again, apply that to anything. Now, let's kind of fast forward a bit. You've won medals, you've set up national championships, you've coached people to the Olympics. 3 decades on from all of that, coming back to 2018 right now, how do you reclaim and recarve out your identity as a person, and what is now your relationship to snowboarding?
I would say that my relationship has evolved. I'm 64 years old now. I'm looked at as an early pioneer, kind of a grandpappy in snowboarding. I had my day, I made my mark. I tried to pass on to others what I had learned. I worked very hard to make sure that we developed racing programs which would constantly give you a new crop of talented riders year after year. We helped create the events around the world. Consulted with the first X Games, which was a huge they were just huge in the growth of snowboarding. The X Games sort of agreed with everything we were doing, the rebelliousness of it, the wildness of the moves. So that was a big deal. Getting to the Olympics was a 20-year process of creating competitions, creating champions, getting sponsorship dollars, getting mountains involved. Just an ongoing, relentless attack on making snowboarding the hottest winter sport that's come along in a long time.
All of those things that you just said are about developing the sport so that other people can access and enjoy it. And here's a question for you. Take all of that and what you did over 20 years to get the sport to the Olympics and your involvement and your contribution in that. Is there a fundamental link going back to the 60s when you first stepped onto a Snurfer and you realized how much you loved it and that you wanted to share that with other people? Is that where it comes from inside, just from a pure heart point of view?
It's a fire in the belly, and again, it crosses over to anything. If you don't have a passion and believe that it can happen, it's not going to happen.
That's it. Okay. So I understand now over the last couple of years locally that you have indeed been involved with some of the local schools and being a snowboard coach. So there's very much still an active connection and taking young teenagers to people that compete locally around New Hampshire. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm very fortunate at this stage in my life and the game to still be up on the mountains. I have been with a private boarding school, Dublin School in New Hampshire. And it's just another way to contribute to the progression of the sport, to teaching kids not only how to ride a snowboard, but how to have etiquette on the mountain, how to share the mountain with not only other snowboarders, but skiers or Nordic skiers. It's been a real honor.
That's beautiful. Now, let me round off with a question. For any of those watching this now that have a vision of something for the future, perhaps it's something that hasn't been done before, what advice would you give them in order to pursue their dreams?
Really and truly, I mean, you got to have the passion. You just have to want to eat, sleep, breathe it 24 hours a day. You have to recognize that not everybody's going to be as excited about it as you are, but that's sort of your job, is to bring them around to that way of thinking. Always include the other person. It's not just about what I want. It's about what we need to make it happen. Another good lesson to learn. When you pitch something, it's got to include everybody. And in my early years, I don't think I was approaching it that way. I just kept telling everybody how much I thought it was great. But over time, as our numbers grew, it's much easier to sell something when a lot of people want it.
That's amazing. And that's a maturing in leadership, isn't it? Because people are attracted to passion. And then as soon as you switch into both expressing the passion, but also including them, then that is indeed how movements start, how passionate organizations begin, and indeed how whole sports are born. So, Paul, it really has been a pleasure speaking with you today. And for those that would like to see more of Paul, Be What You Want, our organization actually is the booking agent for Mr. Paul Graves. He is available internationally for keynote speaking gigs. So go to bewhatyouwant.net and get in contact with us if you'd like to see Paul share his stories with your organization. So thank you once again, Paul. It really has been a pleasure having you on the podcast today.
Thank you, Chris.